Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Since Boise State Public Radio was founded, students have been an integral part of day-to-day operations. We're proud of those who contribute to what we do every day.
My name is Monica Esquivel, and I'm a newsroom intern. With the guidance of award-winning reporters, I get to learn the ropes of working in public media.
On March 4th and 5th, help us connect across campus and through our community. You can fund our student programs with your gift on Bronco Giving Day. Learn more and support at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters. Idaho State budget debate has moved from spreadsheets and committee rooms into a full-scale political and policy fight at the State House. For weeks now, lawmakers have been grappling with how to close a projected budget gap, one that stems from lower than expected revenue, years of tax cuts, and new costs connected to federal tax changes. The legislature's budget writing committee has approved additional across-the-board cuts to most state agencies, on top of a 3% holdback ordered last summer by Governor Brad Little. If approved by the full legislature, many agencies would see total reductions of 4% this year and then 5% going forward. Supporters say the cuts are about fiscal discipline and making sure Idaho doesn't spend more than it takes in, which is a requirement under our state's constitution. Now, critics warn even small percentage cuts could have outsized effects, from mental health services and wildlife response to Medicaid providers, tax return processing, and the state's crisis response system. State agency leaders have cautioned that some reductions could create long-term structural problems that could take years to rebuild. Now, the disagreement isn't just between parties. It's also within Republican leadership, with Governor Little proposing a different approach that uses one-time transfers and reserves rather than deeper ongoing cuts. Democrats, in the meantime, are arguing the current situation is the result of about $4 billion in tax reductions over the past 5 years, which they say has reduced state revenue just as cost pressures are rising. Now, all of this comes as lawmakers face a constitutional deadline: pass a balanced budget before the fiscal year ends. Now, you might remember back in December, right here on Idaho Matters, both of today's guests warned that the state could be heading toward a difficult budget year. So we wanted to check back in with them as the cuts are moving forward to final votes. So today, we're once again joined by our state's Lieutenant Governor, Scott Bedke, and Idaho House Minority Leader, Ilana Rubel. I'd like to welcome both of you back to the program. Thanks for making time for us today.
It's good to be here, Gemma. Thanks for having us.
Cool to be back.
And Lieutenant Governor, let me start the conversation with you, because when we spoke back in December, you warned that Idaho was budgeting backward, deciding priorities before really locking in that revenue. So do you believe these current cuts are correcting the problem, or are they a reaction to decisions that are already made?
Well, it's more at the reaction side of the spectrum, because the decisions were made last year, and the process that I criticized was the last year's process, and so we're lying in the bed that we made, as it were, now, and so it's as we predicted when we were on the program here a few weeks ago, is that it was going to be a tough budget year, and there was going to be this, I think you outlined it very aptly in your lead up here, is that there's less money. Now, to your audience, don't get me wrong. I'm a conservative Republican, and I generally default to less government. But we also have taken on obligations, and commitments that we're having to not deliver on 100%. And so this whole issue of one time and right sizing government forever, this is the issues we're having now they'll blow over. The economy of Idaho is doing quite well, and we will grow out of this in a year or two, and we will be looking back on it by then. And so the governor's approach is less draconian. It's less, it's more easily done because it presumes that the robust times that Idaho is enjoying will fix itself, in the next year or two, and that we don't need to do deep ongoing cuts, particularly in the way that some are proposing. And anyway, so that's kind of the issue. All the bunch of the bills are moving, and we'll see how they fare on the House floor or the Senate floor. But it is, as we predicted, a budget tough year. And that's how it is. So anyway, I'm interested to hear Ilana.
Well, Representative Bell, let me bring you into the conversation as well, because you and other Democrats are arguing that this is not a spending crisis, but it's a revenue problem that was created by tax cuts. So talk to us about what evidence you have that you think best supports that argument right now.
Yeah, I firmly believe it is 100% a revenue problem and not at all a spending problem. And, I really have tried to dig in with agency heads. I serve on the Health and Welfare Committee, and we were tasked with going and trying to find, $50 million of cuts from the health and welfare budget. And I sat down with them and I said, okay, tell me where the bodies are buried. Tell me where is the fat. If there's anything here that can be cut without major pain, where is it? And I believe them. I mean, this was a, private, there was no cameras. They said, look, if there were any fat, we would have found it 5 years ago. Every single year they're dragged through this ringer of trying to find any conceivable savings anywhere. And we are really at the point where we are cutting things that absolutely should not be cut. I mean, we're cutting Meals on Wheels. We're cutting emergency mental health care. We're cutting youth suicide prevention and special ed and water quality. I mean, we are cutting things that on no planet should these be cut. But to the lieutenant governor's point, I think it's actually worth a brief walk down memory lane on exactly how it went down last year, because it is quite astonishing. Historically, we always come in first thing in session and we set the revenue numbers so we know how much money do we have, so that we know how much money can we spend. But they didn't do that last year. They came in, they didn't set a revenue number until the middle of March, by which point the legislature had already passed more than $5 billion, like billion with a B, in tax cuts and vouchers and spending and all of this. But then it got worse, because not only did they kind of, pick the number months into this process, but they picked a number that was completely fiction. We have these smarty pants people at the Division of Financial Management who have PhDs in economics, and they said, we think the revenue that Idaho will have is $5.4 billion. And our budget committee just said, what the heck, let's go with $5.9 billion. And they had no evidence for it. They just picked a number that was $500 million higher than what the experts thought it would be, really for no other purpose than to politically justify the spending they had already made and the tax cuts they'd already passed and the voucher bills they'd already passed. Nobody could credibly have thought that was a real number. So anybody that is now batting their eyes and saying, who knew? What a shock that we were short on revenue. We were screaming it from the mountaintops. It was extremely obvious that they picked a fake revenue number that wasn't going to hold up and that didn't hold up.
Lieutenant Governor, supporters of the cuts say that Idaho needs to match ongoing expenses with ongoing revenue and avoid one-time fixes. I'm curious, why is that principle especially important in this moment?
Well, at 10,000 feet, I agree 100%. We need to be structurally balanced. Ongoing money for ongoing things, one time for one time, et cetera. But I think that the dilemma that we're talking about here is not an ongoing dilemma. The economy is still growing. We are not in recession. And so we will grow out of this. And so to those that say, but there are others that say the best way to control government spending is just cut the dollars. Now, keep in mind that this is going to be a legislative decision. They own this. They own the situation we're in, and they got to get us out of it. So, but those of us that have been around for a while and arguably a student of the process, it's not offensive to this Idahoan that we use bridging techniques, if you will, to get through the next year or two. And I'm not talking tapping the rainy day funds, but that would be an option. But the governor's budget balances in a straight-faced way, and it's sitting on every legislator's desk under the pile of stuff that they have there. It balances. It's the quickest way out of this session. It's the least painful way out of this session. And I encourage the legislators to take a hard look. Another thing that I'm not liking, as I hear some of the discussions, is this fixation with across the board, and that's kind of a, it's been described as a lazy man's way of budgeting, and I don't have a lot of problem with that definition, frankly, because when you cut across the board, you get all the good stuff gets cut, all the bad stuff gets cut, rather than the surgical approach that was referenced earlier. And so we can fix this. It's not the end of the world, but there's going to be some short-term pain, but emphasis on the short term because of the decisions that were made last year, and to use this as a shield or as an excuse to go deeper than you need to get out of this year and possibly part of next, then that's where I start having issues. Idaho's doing well, the economy's growing, we can grow our way out of this, but shame on us for last year. We got to fix it this year. Let's roll up our sleeves and do it.
So, Lieutenant Governor, you mentioned the rainy day fund, and Representative Rubel, I want to bring you back into the conversation because there are Republican budget writers that say that if we dip into the rainy day funds during a healthy economy, it's setting a bad precedent. I think a lot of folks, though, who pay attention are wondering, isn't that what a rainy day fund is for? And why should we not use those reserves right now?
I guess, well, I would say, given the political options in front of us, I am an advocate for using the rainy day funds. But somebody on City Club used the line that I just have to steal, which is it really raining if the legislature just picked up a bucket of water and dumped it over its head? Which is really where we're at. It's not raining. It's just they made very foolish budget decisions that have left us in a pickle. Frankly, it could be fixed in a much better structural way if they were willing to have the discussion. We could peel back some of the tax cuts that put us in the situation that we couldn't afford. They could get rid of the voucher program. We could repeal all of the bills that put us in these dire straits. It's just that the powers that be in the legislature won't let us have that discussion. And so given that they have just put a blockade on, to me, better long-term fixes, the only thing we're left with now is the rainy day fund, which I think is certainly better than not doing it. And, this is not something in the near term. There are people who will be suffering and frankly dead before we get a chance to fix this in future years. 3 people have already died in the emergency crisis mental health program that was terminated at the end of the year. There are people for whom we can't go back and bring those meals to hungry seniors when their Meals on Wheels have been cut. There is an immediate near-term crisis that has to be addressed. The rainy day fund is not the best way to fix it, but it might be the only politically acceptable way given the folks who are currently at the steering wheel.
So, Lieutenant Governor, we're seeing unusual public disagreement between legislative budget leaders and Governor Little. In fact, Representative Josh Tanner and others have criticized the governor's budget. I mean, they're calling it gimmicky with all of the one-time transfers. So is this fundamentally a policy disagreement or a philosophical one about how government should manage uncertainty?
It's what is gimmicky, if that's the phrase we're going to use, is the legislature's insistence that we right size. Now that is a smokescreen to cover the mistakes that were made last year, and and we can do that without admitting anything, and we go forward. I think that why I like the governor's budget is that it acknowledges that we could have done it better last year. It acknowledges that we're in a short-term crisis here. Well, the short-term pickle, I think, but depending on where you land, it's a crisis. I get that. But it also acknowledges that the economy, that things are going well in Idaho, and that this will be short-term in nature. And so rather than take one-time money like, rather than going to the rainy day fund, what the governor's budget did was go to the interest that is accrues at the various funds, including the rainy day fund, and plugs that in for this year. And we'll maybe have to do it again next year, but that amounts to a chunk of money. It gets us through the crisis. It doesn't overreact to the crisis and do other things because we have, quote, a crisis. The crisis is because we got out ahead of our headlights a little bit. And now here we are. And so all of this talk of right sizing is tantamount to camouflaging the real issue, which was the mistakes were made last year, and let's not compound them. Let's fix it. Right size. I'm all for right sizing all the time. And I'm all for being very careful with taxpayer money. But I'm also very about living up to agreements and commitments that we make, and all doing that within the taxpayer's budget. I get all that. I live that. I that's what I want. But any of this other talk is arguably a deflection tactic. There, I said
Representative, appreciate your transparency. Representative Rubel, do you think that the governor's alternative plan go far enough? I mean, do you think that this could fix the whether we want to call it a crisis or a pickle that the state is in?
Well, I think, the governor was coming in with these 3% across the board cuts that he was proposing to keep in place. I think those are already very, very problematic. So remember, a lot of the most painful cuts were cuts that were made by the governor before we even came into session. The, complete termination of, the mobile mental health crisis program, the cuts to reimbursement rates that effectively deprived a lot of people with disabilities of nursing care. A lot of those cuts were already in the cut, in the governor's piece. I do agree with sweeping the interest payments. I think that is a good solution. But I am a little concerned about the cuts the governor made. Again, I feel like there's this really low-hanging fruit just sitting there that we should be grabbing. Why on planet Earth are we sending out $5,000 private school tuition checks to many of the wealthiest families in the state and cutting Meals on Wheels and youth suicide prevention? It's insane. I do not know how you justify that at the pearly gates. It's just, we have $50 million just sitting there with a million so much better places to put it. There are ways to get revenue back that are not gimmicky at all and that have the advantage of really boosting our long-term stability. It's really just a political will question. But I really feel like the responsible path would be to literally just go back and undo some of the bad decisions that were made last year. And there's no reason on earth we couldn't do that.
Lieutenant Governor.
Can I jump in here a little bit? I mean, in Idaho, we focus on the fundamentals. We've been successful as a state because we focus on the fundamentals. The listeners, I mean, you have some very astute listeners, but most Idahoans are all about solutions. They want to move on and get this fixed and don't do it again. That's what we should be about here. And I appreciate all of the hardship that this creates. But what's done is done, and now we have to go forward in a way that we possibly, as best we can. We're halfway through the session, so there's no dies have been cast. So all of this stuff that we're talking about is still up in the air and still on the table, frankly. And I appreciate all those stakeholders out there coming to the Capitol. They should do that. They need to make their cases. But I would urge I would urge the legislature to focus on the fundamentals. Across the board cuts don't focus on the fundamentals, and that does additional harm when none is owed to anyone. We can fix this. We should do that. The governor's budget does that, and it minimizes it minimizes impacts out past 2 years. The others last forever.
So, Lieutenant Governor, if these cuts pass and then we see agencies struggling later, we're talking maybe delayed tax refunds, fewer services like mental health services, staffing shortages. I mean, we are probably going to see a decent wildfire season coming up in the summer. We may not have staffing for that. People are going to be asking questions, even if they're not paying attention now. At some point, people will pay attention when it impacts them. If it gets to that point, who should voters be holding accountable for those decisions?
The legislature. They set the budgets. I mean, the executive branch carries out the laws that the legislature sets, including the budget. So, but here's the thing. We all of this discussion should be about prioritization, focusing on the fundamentals. All of the issues will come out, and I think our system works when we have an informed body politic. And I know you're doing the best you can to do that, and I want to help in that. But the legislature needs to remember the economic rule that was taught to us in the Fram oil commercial, that you pay now or you pay later. And that principle ought to resonate with conservative Idahoans. That, there are things that we're going to have to do now because it avoids larger costs down the road. And I think many of the things that Representative Rubel has talked about fall into this category. And there are certain obligations that you cannot get out of as a state with regard to our citizens, and we have misplaced some of those priorities. And I think we need to refocus that or change the laws. But our hands are in many ways tied by federal law as well. There's a certain segment of our population we're going to take care of, whether we like it or not.
I have about 2 minutes left with you, and I want to ask the same final question to both of you. So, Representative Rubel, let me begin with you. In your view, what does a responsible Idaho budget look like 3 years from now?
A responsible budget, I think we need to find a way to get our revenue back. And I think there are a lot of really quite painless ways to do that. I mentioned, voucher repeal, undoing some of the cuts from last session. I think we need to do a holistic review of our sales tax exemptions. We lose about $2.5 billion a year in sales tax exemptions, many of which haven't been looked at since the 70s or 80s. I think we need to look at those and see if they really make sense anymore. So I think on the one side, we need to look at bolstering our revenue. We always need to be very careful on our expenditures. But I think the Lieutenant Governor just made an excellent point, which is we are doing a lot of stuff right now that is penny wise, pound foolish. And we've seen already, I think, a 43% increase in arrests since the termination of these emergency mental health programs. We are seeing prison populations explode. It actually costs you a lot more money when you get rid of some of these preventive programs and just, wait for a crisis to explode down the road. So I think we would have to look at our spending with an eye to how do we actually save money from downstream disasters.
And same question for you, Lieutenant Governor. What does a responsible Idaho budget look like 3 years from now?
Well, it looks exactly like it's always been through the years. We're going to focus on the fundamentals. We need to be making the proper investments in infrastructure, both on our transportation systems and our water systems, and in the soft infrastructure called people. And that's education. That is taking care of the vulnerable in our communities. And that's what it's looked like. Idaho is great because we've always been pretty good at doing that. And I think that So if we're looking down the road, I want a budget that does exactly that. We're one of the fastest growing states, and to ignore the basic infrastructure requirements of a fast growing state is folly.
I want to thank both of you so much for taking time to talk to us once again today. I know how busy both of you are. And thank you for the work that you do as well. I know there's a lot of times not enough acknowledgement for the work that both of you put in. So I appreciate your time today and your candor as well. We've been speaking with Idaho Lieutenant Governor Scott Bedke and House Minority Leader Representative Alana Rubel about the ongoing budget battle at the Idaho State House. This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
Hi, it's Terry Gross, host of Fresh Air. Hey, take a break from the 24-hour news cycle with us and listen to long-form interviews with your favorite authors, actors, filmmakers, comedians, and musicians, the people making the art that nourishes us and speaks to our times. So listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.